A strong cowboy rescues a lost traveler. An emotional ranch romance story, Cowboy Secrets. The first thing Eli Harrow heard was silence. Not the comfortable kind, not the wide, breathing silence of the open Texas plains that he had known his whole life, the kind that rolled across the grassland like slow water and settled into your bones like something sacred. No, this was a different kind of silence. The kind that sits too still. The kind that makes the hair on the back of your neck rise before your brain even catches up to tell you why. He pulled his horse, Ranger, to a slow stop at the top of the ridge. The morning sun was barely an hour old. It hung low and orange gold over the eastern horizon, dragging long purple shadows across the scrubland and the dry creek bed below. Everything was as it should have been: the same rocky terrain, the same patchy mesquite grass, the same pale limestone outcroppings jutting from the earth like old bones. Eli had ridden this stretch of fence line every morning for 4 years. He could close his eyes and describe every stone, every dip, every place where the wire sagged from the post. But today something was wrong. Ranger shifted beneath him, stamping one heavy hoof and tossing his head. The horse felt it too. That was enough for Eli. He pressed his heels into Ranger's sides and walked him slowly down the ridge, eyes scanning the dry creek bed. The sun caught something reflective, glass, maybe, or metal. Eli squinted. His hand dropped instinctively to the rope coiled at his saddle horn, a reflex born from years of untangling fence wire and pulling calves from mud. Then he saw him. About 30 feet from the edge of the dry creek bed, half hidden by a fall of tall, yellowed grass, there was a man lying face down in the red dirt. Eli's breath left him. He dismounted before Ranger fully stopped, landing hard and moving fast, boots crunching over loose gravel as he crossed the distance in long strides. His first thought was emergency, rattlesnake, heat exhaustion, a fall. His second thought, arriving barely a fraction of a second later, was that the man was young. The worn gray backpack still strapped to his shoulders, the slim build, the dark hair pushed messily against the dirt, all of it red, young, and out of place. Eli dropped to one knee beside him and pressed 2 fingers to the side of his neck. A pulse strong and steady. He exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "Hey," Eli's voice was low, rough from disuse. He hadn't spoken to anyone yet that morning. He hadn't spoken much to anyone the day before either. "Hey, can you hear me?" "Nothing." He carefully rolled the man onto his back, one hand bracing his shoulder, the other catching his head before it could knock against the rocks. The man's face turned upward toward the sky and Eli went still for just a second. He was even covered in red dust and dried sweat, even with his lower lip cracked and his dark lashes pressed heavy against his cheeks like he was sleeping through something terrible he was striking. Strong jaw, high cheekbones, a straight nose, a faded bruise along his left temple, maybe 2 days old. Dark circles beneath eyes that hadn't opened yet, a knot of dried blood at his hairline, small but there. He'd been out here a while. Eli pressed the back of his hand against the man's forehead. The heat coming off his skin was alarming. "All right," Eli murmured, already reaching for the canteen at his hip. He unscrewed the cap, tilted the man's head slightly, and let a small trickle of water run across his lips. Then he waited, then he did it again. On the third pass, the man's throat moved. He swallowed. And then slowly, almost painfully, his eyes opened. They were dark brown, nearly black in the early morning light. They stared up at the sky for a full 3 seconds with the blank, uncomprehending gaze of someone who doesn't know where they are or how they got there. And then they focused. They found Eli's face, and the man said in a voice so hoarse it barely registered as sound, "Are you real?" Eli blinked. Something in his chest moved in a way he didn't quite have a name for. "Yeah," he said, "I'm real." The man let out a long, trembling breath. His eyes fell closed again. "Good," he whispered, "I thought I was dying." His name was Caleb Merritt. Eli learned this from the ID card in the front pocket of his backpack 20 minutes later, after Caleb had slipped back into unconsciousness, and Eli had made the call on his radio that he was coming in with an injured traveler. By the time Ranger carried them both, Eli upright, Caleb slumped carefully against his chest, held in place by one steady arm, back across the ridge and down the long track toward the Harrow Ranch. The sun had climbed enough to start biting. The ranch house came into view the way it always did on the return from a morning ride, slowly, piecemeal, a rooftop here, a water tank there. The red barn growing larger until the whole dusty compound spread out beneath the cottonwood trees like something that had always been there and always would be. Eli's grandmother, Dora Harrow, was already on the front porch with her arms crossed and her expression set to the particular combination of worry and practical calm that had defined her face for as long as Eli could remember. Behind her, The screen door banged open and out came Marco, the ranch's other full-time hand, already pulling off his work gloves. "Lord have mercy," Dora said, coming down the porch steps. "How long was he out there?" "Don't know, could have been all night." Eli swung down from Ranger and Marco stepped forward to take the horse's reins. Eli caught Caleb's weight as he slid down, getting an arm under his knees, one behind his shoulders. Caleb stirred but didn't wake. "He's got a fever, dehydrated, there's a head wound, looks older, not fresh." "Get him inside," Dora said and turned for the door. They put Caleb in the spare room at the end of the hallway, the one with the single window that faced the cottonwood trees and the long view of the south pasture. It had been Eli's uncle's room once a long time ago, before the ranch became only the two of them, and then three when Marco came on 5 years back. It still had the same blue-checked curtains, the same narrow bed with the iron headboard, the same braided rug on the floor. Dora cleaned the wound on Caleb's head with steady hands and quiet efficiency, and Eli stood in the doorway and watched. He wasn't sure why he stayed. There was plenty of work to get back to. There was always work on a ranch, more than enough to fill every hour of every day from sunup to well past sundown. He should have handed this off to Dora and gone back to his fence line, back to his quiet and his routine, back to the known shape of his day. That was what he normally would have done. Instead, he stayed in the doorway with his arms folded across his chest and his hat in one hand, watching Dora work, watching the slow rise and fall of Caleb Merritt's chest. "Go on," Dora said without looking up. "I've got him." Eli pushed off the doorframe. "I'll check back in an hour." "You'll do no such thing," Dora said, and there was just enough amusement in her voice to make Eli pause. "You'll go fix the Section 7 fence like you were supposed to yesterday. I'll come get you when he wakes." Eli put his hat on. "I found him." "I noticed." So nothing, Eli James Harrow, he's not going anywhere, go fix the fence." He went and fixed the fence. But the whole 3 hours he was out there, working wire in the building heat, the image that kept returning to him, without his permission, without any reason he could articulate, was the moment those dark eyes had opened and looked up at him from the dirt. "Are you real?" He yanked the fence wire taut and fastened it to the post with more force than was strictly necessary. Caleb Merritt woke at 2:30 in the afternoon. Eli knew this because Dora appeared at the barn door at exactly 2:31 according to the old clock above the workbench and said simply, "He's up." Eli set down the leather strap he was mending and stood. The spare room was dim and cool when he pushed open the door. The curtains filtered the afternoon light into soft amber bands that lay across the floor and the bed, and Caleb was sitting upright, barely, with a pillow wedged behind him, holding a glass of water in both hands with the intense concentration of someone who is very aware that dropping it would be embarrassing. He looked up when Eli came in. Up close, cleaned up with the dust washed away and the color coming back into his face, he looked different than he had in the field. Not less striking, more, if anything. He had the kind of face that sharpened as it recovered, cheekbones and jaw and the clean architecture of his features reasserting themselves against the fatting pallor. He looked, Eli thought, like someone who was used to being competent and was currently annoyed at himself for not being so. "You're the one who found me," Caleb said. His voice was still rough but stronger than it had been. "Yeah. Your grandmother told me," he paused. "She also told me I'm an idiot." Eli crossed his arms. "She say it in those words. She said, and I'm quoting here, 'Young man, the Texas backcountry is not a place you walk through without water, a map, or any visible common sense.'" A very small, very self-deprecating smile appeared at the corner of Caleb's mouth. It transformed his face in a way that Eli was unprepared for, which amounts to the same thing. Eli moved to the chair against the wall and pulled it closer to the bed before he quite decided to do so. He sat. "Where were you headed?" Caleb's smile faded. He looked down at the glass of water in his hands. "Nowhere specific." "People who are going nowhere specific usually drive," Eli said, "or at least bring water." "My car broke down." He said it simply, factually, but something in his voice closed off slightly, like a door being eased shut. "About 12 miles west of here, 3 days ago." 3 days, Eli stared at him. "You walked for 3 days." "I had a little water and then I didn't." Caleb looked up and there was something in his expression that was not embarrassment, it was something harder to name. Determined, maybe, like a man who has decided that what happened to him is simply what happened and there's no use in anything but accepting it. "I found a farmhouse on the second day but no one was home. I kept walking." Why didn't you stay at the farmhouse, wait for someone to come back? Caleb was quiet for a moment. He turned the glass slowly in his hands. I needed to keep moving, he said finally, and then, before Eli could ask why, he added, thank you for finding me and for, he gestured vaguely at the room, the bed, the glass of water, all of this. You're on Harrow land, Eli said. We take care of what comes onto Harrow land. Caleb looked at him with those dark eyes, and there was something there, something that was trying to figure Eli out, reading him carefully from across the narrow space between the chair and the bed. That's a very cowboy thing to say. Eli felt very faintly and without any real explanation the back of his neck warm. It's just a fact. Still, Caleb's voice was quieter now, the slight edge of wry amusement softening into something more sincere. Thank you, Eli. It was the first time the man had used his name. Eli had no reason to notice that. There was no reason at all that the sound of it, his own name, a name he had heard 10,000 times, should land in his chest differently coming from this particular mouth. He stood up and pushed the chair back to the wall. You need to rest, he said. Doctor's coming by tomorrow morning to check that head wound. Stay in bed until she does. Yes, sir, Caleb said, and there was the ghost of that small smile again. Eli turned for the door. He stopped with his hand on the frame and, without quite planning to, turned back. What's your phone number? I'll call someone to come get you. The smile disappeared. I'm fine, Caleb said. I don't need. I'm not offering to keep you forever, Eli said, just pointing out you've got people who are probably wondering where you are. Something shifted in Caleb's expression, something that could have been pain if pain looked like a door being closed very quietly. I don't have anyone waiting, he said, not right now. Eli looked at him for a long moment. Then he nodded once, turned away, and went back to work. Dr. Pena came the next morning, pronounced Caleb dehydrated but recovering, noted a mild concussion, hence the head wound, hence the 3 days of disorientation and poor judgment in the Texas wilderness, hence almost everything, and told him to rest for a minimum of 4 days before traveling anywhere. But I can go, Caleb said, sitting on the edge of the spare room bed with his hands on his knees and the expression of a man who absolutely cannot stand being told to sit still. You can go, Dr. Pena agreed pleasantly, snapping her bag shut, if you want another episode and no one to find you the second time. She glanced at Eli, who was standing in the doorway. 4 days. 4 days, Eli confirmed. Caleb looked at him, then at Dr. Pena, then at the window and the bright morning outside as if he was calculating something. Fine, he said at last. Glad we agree, said Dr. Pena and left. Eli brought Caleb breakfast, toast, eggs, strong coffee, and set it on the nightstand. You don't have to wait on me, Caleb said. I know, Eli turned to go. Can I? Caleb stopped. When Eli looked back, there was a slight color in Caleb's cheeks that hadn't been there the day before. Can I at least sit on the porch? I feel like the walls are already moving. Eli considered him. You steady on your feet. I walked 12 miles through scrubland for 3 days. You also passed out face down in a dry creek bed. I'd like to think those two facts cancel each other out, Caleb said gravely. Eli almost smiled. It almost happened. Porch, he said, not the yard, not the barn, the porch. I accept those terms. So Caleb spent that first day on the wide front porch of the Harrow Ranch house, sitting in one of the 2 rocking chairs with his feet stretched out and Dora's old quilt over his knees even though the afternoon was warm, watching the activity of the ranch with the focused, quiet attention of someone who has spent too long inside his own head and is grateful for anything else to look at. Eli moved through the day's work at his usual pace, but he was aware in a low, steady, background kind of way of the figure on the porch. He was aware of it the way you're aware of something that has changed in a landscape you know by heart, not unpleasant, just there, just different. At one point in the early afternoon, leading a pair of young heifers up from the south pasture, he glanced toward the house and found Caleb watching him. They looked at each other across the distance for a moment. Then Caleb lifted a hand in a small wave. Eli gave him a nod and turned back to the heifers. He was thinking about that small wave for longer than was sensible. On the second day, Caleb graduated from the porch to the yard. He showed up at the barn at 8 in the morning, wearing borrowed jeans that were slightly too long and one of Eli's old flannel shirts that was slightly too wide across the shoulders, and said, tell me what to do. Eli looked at him. The deal was the porch. The deal was 4 days of rest. I'm not resting, I'm helping. He met Eli's gaze with an evenness that Eli was starting to recognize, the look of someone who was more at home in motion than in stillness, who needed purpose the way other people needed sleep. I can carry, I can stack, I can fill troughs, I'm not useless. Marco appeared behind Eli's left shoulder at precisely that moment, looked at Caleb, looked at Eli, and said nothing. He had a talent for that, appearing and disappearing like smoke, saying nothing at the most useful moments. Trough duty, Eli said at last. Caleb's face did something that was not quite a smile but was in the neighborhood. Where's the hose? So Caleb became, by default and without any formal arrangement, a temporary presence at the Harrow Ranch for the duration of his recovery. He filled troughs and carried feed and helped Marco mend a stretch of pasture gate and stacked bales under Eli's quiet direction. He was not a natural rancher. He moved with the careful deliberateness of someone learning a physical language that wasn't his mother tongue, but he was not careless. He paid attention. He asked questions. He did not complain. On the second night, Dora made a pot of pinto beans and cornbread, and they all sat around the kitchen table together. And it was the first time Eli noticed how naturally Caleb fit into a room. He had a gift for listening, for meeting people where they were. He drew Marco out with 3 questions about his family in Sonora, and within 20 minutes had Marco laughing about something that had happened to his cousin at a county fair. He asked Dora about the ranch's history, how long it had been in the family, what it was like when she was young, and Dora, who did not as a rule talk freely to strangers, talked for nearly an hour. Eli watched this and ate his beans and said very little, which was not unusual. He said very little at most dinners. But he was watching. And once, when Caleb said something that made Dora laugh, a real laugh, the rare kind that reached her eyes, Caleb turned his head and found Eli already looking at him, and for a half-second they just looked at each other across the table, and something moved between them that was too quiet to name. Caleb looked away first. Eli looked at his beans. Dora kept laughing. By the 3rd day, something had shifted. It was nothing dramatic, no single moment you could point to and say, there, that's when it changed. It was more like the slow turning of light in an afternoon, 1 degree at a time, until you looked up and noticed the shadows had moved without you watching them move. Eli found himself calibrating his day differently, not consciously, not with any plan or intention. Just he would be coming in from the east pasture and he would take the long way back past the barn where Caleb was working with Marco, not because it was the direct route but because it was a route and it was fine. He would finish an afternoon task and register, somewhere in the back of his mind, that Caleb would probably be on the porch by now. He would come up from the creek in the evening, boots dusty and shirt stuck to his back, and find himself looking toward the house before looking anywhere else. It was nothing, it was just awareness, that's all. He'd had long days of solitary work before Caleb arrived. He would have them again after Caleb left. There was nothing wrong with the temporary presence of another human being during the middle hours. He told himself this on the 3rd evening while he was sitting on the top rail of the corral fence, watching the horses move in the last of the sunlight and meaning it entirely. Then Caleb appeared at his elbow. He had a habit of that, of appearing at Eli's side without announcement, without the usual social prelude of footsteps or conversation opening. He would just be there companionably, standing next to you as if he'd always been standing next to you and would continue to do so indefinitely. It should have been strange. It wasn't. The gray one, Caleb said, nodding toward the horses. What's her name? Luna. She doesn't move the same as the others. Eli looked. Luna was indeed moving differently, slightly favoring her left front leg, not dramatically, but enough if you knew what you were looking at. He'd been watching it for the past 10 minutes, running it through his mental catalog of possible causes. She slipped in the mud yesterday, he said. Just a strain, she'll be fine by the weekend. How do you know? Because I know her, he said it simply without thinking about how it would sound. Caleb was quiet for a moment. How long have you had her? 5 years, bought her as a 2-year-old from a farm outside Uvalde. He paused. She bit me twice in the first month. I think she was testing me. Did she figure out you passed? She hasn't bitten me since. Caleb leaned on the fence rail, forearms resting on the top bar, close enough that Eli could sense the warmth of him in the cooling evening air. Not too close, just close enough to notice. What about Ranger? Since I was 17, Eli looked at the big chestnut standing apart from the others, always slightly apart. He belonged to my father before that. He didn't say anything more than that. He hadn't meant to say that much. But Caleb didn't push it, didn't ask the question that Eli could see forming and then being gently set aside. Instead, he just nodded slowly and looked at Ranger with the quiet respect of someone who understands that some things are not about the words that surround them. "I used to ride," Caleb said after a while, "when I was a kid. My grandfather had 2 horses on a small property upstate. I'd go every summer." He paused. "I haven't been on a horse in maybe 7 years. "Why not?" Caleb turned his head and looked at Eli. The light was almost gone now, just a thin orange seam at the western horizon, and in the near-dark Caleb's face was difficult to read. "Things change," he said simply. "You stop going back to places." "Why?" "Because going back is harder than it sounds." His voice was even, measured, like someone who has made peace with something but hasn't forgotten what the making peace cost. "Sometimes it's easier to just go forward." Eli looked at him for a moment. The horses moved quietly in the dark behind them. "Where were you going?" he asked, before the car broke down. Caleb turned back to the horses. A long pause, then, "Somewhere with fewer people who knew me." "That's a wide destination." "I know." He was quiet again. Then, quietly, "Have you ever felt like the version of yourself that everyone around you sees isn't really you? Like you've been performing a version of yourself for so long that you can't quite remember when you stopped being sure which parts were real?" The question came out low and careful, like something Caleb hadn't meant to say out loud and was now watching to see how it landed. Eli sat with it for a moment. "Yeah," he said, "I know what that feels like." Caleb looked at him. In the dark, his expression was open in a way it hadn't been before, stripped of the wry edge, the self-deprecating armor, all the careful social competence. Just open, surprised maybe at the straightforward answer. "I was starting to think I was the only one," he said. "You're not." The horses moved. The night deepened. They sat on the fence rail in the dark for another 20 minutes without speaking, and the silence between them was not the kind that needs to be filled. On the 4th morning, the last morning, by Dr. Peña's accounting, Eli woke early, which was not unusual. What was unusual was that when he came down to the kitchen at 5:45 with the pre-dawn sky still purple outside the window, Caleb was already there. He was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and Dora's old notebook of ranch records spread open in front of him, studying something with an expression of intense concentration. He was wearing the same borrowed flannel shirt from the day before, and his dark hair was doing what dark hair does in the early morning when no one has seen it yet, falling forward across his forehead in a way that was entirely unself-conscious. He looked up when Eli came in. "The grazing rotation," Caleb said without preamble, turning the notebook toward Eli. "Your south pasture is being overused. If you pull the herd to the west sections for the next 6 weeks and let the south rest, you'll have better grass by fall." Eli poured his coffee and looked at the notebook. Caleb had been making notes in the margins, small, neat handwriting, observations about the pasture maps, acreage calculations. "You know ranching," Eli said. "I know land management." Caleb pulled the notebook back toward himself. "I studied it, briefly." The word briefly carried something, a weight, a history, something that had not concluded cleanly. "Where?" "Colorado State Agricultural Sciences for 2 years, he closed the notebook, "and then I didn't." Eli poured a second cup of coffee and set it in front of Caleb's empty cup without being asked. It was a reflex, something he would have done for Dora or Marco. It didn't mean anything. Caleb looked at the cup for just a second before reaching for it. "Thank you." He wrapped both hands around it and looked at the closed notebook. "I used to think that was where I was going, that degree, that path, everything lined up and clear." He turned the cup slowly in his hands, and then I woke up one day and realized I'd been building someone else's version of my life, someone else's idea of what made sense for me, and he stopped, looked at the window. I stopped. "And drove west." "And drove west," he exhaled, "right up until the car had a different opinion." Eli sat down across from him at the table. This was also not something he'd planned. He sat down and it was just what happened next, the way one thing follows another in the early morning when the world is quiet and the light is the color of a held breath. "What was the other version?" he asked. "The one that wasn't yours." Caleb looked at him. There was a long pause, the kind where someone is deciding something. "My father has a very clear picture of who I am," Caleb said carefully. "And it's not a bad picture exactly, it's actually a very good picture Good job, good future, good. He paused and something passed across his face, quick and controlled. Good life, by his standards, by almost anyone's standards. He turned the coffee cup, just not mine. Eli studied the surface of his own coffee. Because of what you want. Because of who I am. The words were quiet, deliberate. They lay on the table between them, small and certain. The kitchen was very still. Eli lifted his eyes and looked at Caleb. Caleb looked back. Neither of them said anything for a long moment. There was nothing in the silence that was hostile or frightened. There was nothing that needed to be explained or confirmed or navigated around. It was just two people in a kitchen in the early morning with their coffee and the slowly brightening window, being present with something that had been said. The land management observation, Eli said at last. About the south pasture. Caleb blinked, then the corner of his mouth turned up. Yeah. You're right, I've been thinking the same thing for 2 months. Caleb's small smile became a slightly larger one. Good to know I haven't lost everything. You haven't lost anything, Eli said. He said it plainly, not warmly, not with any special weight or intention. Just plainly the way you state a fact that seems obvious and doesn't need embellishment. But Caleb's expression did something when he heard it. Something that happened in his eyes before his face had time to arrange itself. Something that looked a great deal like being seen by someone who wasn't even trying. He looked down at his coffee cup. Your grandmother told me I can stay through the weekend, he said, if I wanted. She told you that. This morning, well, he glanced at the clock. Yesterday she was up at 4. Eli thought about saying you should probably go. He thought about saying it's not a good idea, there's nothing here, you need to get back to wherever you're going. He thought about saying several sensible things that would have had the virtue of being true. The weekend's 3 more days, he said. I know, Caleb said. Dora doesn't make that offer unless she means it. I know that too. Eli stood up and took his coffee to the window. The sky was going from purple to pink and the first edge of the sun was beginning to show beyond the ridge where he'd found Caleb 4 mornings ago. The horses were moving in the south pasture. The day was beginning. The offer stands, he said with his back to the table. It's up to you. I think I'd like to stay, Caleb said. Eli nodded once at the window. Outside the sun came up. The days that followed settled into a rhythm that felt, Eli thought, dangerous in its naturalness. It was the ease of it that was dangerous, not the feeling itself. The feeling was simply present, like the weather, like the heat that built through the days and broke in brief cool evenings. The feeling was not something Eli spent energy on managing or analyzing. He had spent enough years in his own company, on this stretch of land, with the particular privacy of a life lived mostly in his head, to know himself well enough not to be surprised by what he felt. He was not unfamiliar with this kind of feeling. He had had versions of it before. What he wasn't used to was the ease of it, the way it didn't fight with anything. Because Caleb Merritt, for all the ways he was clearly running from something, was also the most naturally present person Eli had ever been around. He didn't perform comfort. He didn't work at ease. He just was. He showed up in the morning and worked beside you and said the thing that was true and didn't say the thing that wasn't, and somehow the whole day was better for it without any visible effort on his part. This was what Eli noticed in the days that followed, the accumulation of small things. The way Caleb learned the horses. He spent an hour with each of them, introduced himself slowly, quietly, with flat hands and zero agenda, and by the end of the second day Luna was following him to the fence. Eli watched this from across the yard and felt something complicated. Ranger characteristically watched from a distance. He had standards. The way Caleb and Marco fell into an easy working friendship, ribbing each other with the particular comfortable irreverence of men who have decided quickly that they're on the same side. Marco was not easily won. He had worked alongside Eli for 5 years, and their understanding was built of long silences and mutual competence, not talk. But Caleb made Marco laugh, and more than that, made him talk. Eli overheard snatches of conversation from across the yard. Caleb asking about Marco's family's land in Sonora. Marco explaining the old way of tracking weather by how the cattle moved in the afternoon. Real conversation. The kind that meant something. The way Caleb read in the evenings, sitting in the second rocking chair on the porch with a book borrowed from Dora's shelf, and when Eli came up from the last evening check and settled into the first rocking chair, they would sit there in the going dark with nothing said, just the creak of the chairs and the sound of the land, and it was not uncomfortable. It was something else. Something that had a different quality from loneliness and a different quality from company. Something in between that Eli didn't have a word for. The way Caleb said his name. This was a small thing, a very small thing. Eli was aware of nodding it and aware of the absurdity of nodding it and noted it anyway. His name, said by various people, was a sound, a functional sound. It meant you and I need something and listen. It had 100 inflections depending on context and had never in 24 years been more than that. Caleb said it differently. He said it like he'd thought about it first, like he had considered the word and decided it was the right one, like saying Eli was a choice rather than a reflex. It was nothing, it was a name. People said names. It was nothing. On the fifth evening there was a storm. It came in the way summer storms come in Texas, fast and from the west, the sky going from white-hot to green-gray in under an hour, the wind picking up, the smell of the air changing from dust to electricity. Eli was in the barn when it hit, finishing the last check on Luna's leg, and the rain arrived with the instantaneous ferocity of something that had been waiting. He was running through a mental checklist: horses secured, check; east gate closed, check; Marco had taken the tractor to the north shed, check, when he heard the door behind him swing open and bang against the wall. Caleb, wet through in about 30 seconds, stumbled in from the rain, pushed his soaked hair back from his face, and looked around the barn with the wide eyes of someone who has just been very surprised by weather. That, he said, happened very fast. Eli looked at him. He was soaked completely, shirt plastered to him, hair dripping, jeans dark with rain, breathing a little hard from the run across the yard. There was nothing in this that was Eli's business. It was rain. A man got wet in rain. Eli turned away and checked Luna's water bucket. "Is this normal?" Caleb asked, peering out the barn door at the wall of rain. Lightning hit somewhere to the northwest, close enough that the crack of it was nearly simultaneous with the flash. "For summer," Eli said. "The horses aren't bothered. They know this barn." He moved along the stalls, checking each horse in turn, the familiar routine occupying his hands while his awareness tracked Caleb moving through the space behind him, not nervously, not in the way you track an intrusion, just tracked, the way you're aware of light when it changes. "What do you do in a storm?" Caleb asked. He had drifted to the central bay where the hay was stacked and was leaning against one of the posts, arms crossed, watching Eli move through the routine. "Wait." Eli unhooked Luna's empty water bucket and carried it to the tap. "Nothing to do but wait." "You like that?" He looked at Caleb over his shoulder. "Like what?" "Waiting." There was something in Caleb's voice, genuine curiosity, the kind that was really asking, not just filling silence. "You're good at being still. I've been watching you. Most people, you can see them when they get impatient. With you it's like," he tilted his head slightly, "like you're just in it, whatever it is." Eli considered this. He filled the bucket and rehung it. "I grew up here," he said. "You learn what you can change and what you can't. A storm is a storm. You get out of its way and you wait. What if you can't get out of the way? Then you stand in it." He turned and met Caleb's eyes. "And you wait." Caleb looked at him for a long moment. The rain hammered the barn roof. The horses shifted and breathed. Outside, the lightning came again, and in the white flash Caleb's face was illuminated for just a second, every line of it sharp and clear, eyes dark and still focused on Eli, expression something that Eli couldn't name quickly enough before the light was gone. "I haven't been still in a long time," Caleb said quietly. "I keep thinking that if I stop moving, everything I'm running from will catch up." "Maybe it already has," Eli said. He hadn't planned to say it. It came out the way things come out in barns during storms, simply in the absence of reason not to. Caleb blinked. "The car broke down," Eli went on, returning to his circuit of the stalls. "You walked for 3 days, you ended up face down in the dirt on somebody else's property. If catching up is coming for you, it has a head start." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "Then, that's a very practical way to tell someone their problems have caught them." "I'm a practical person." "I've noticed." A pause. "Is that—" Caleb stopped. Eli looked at him. Caleb was looking at the floor, and there was a slight color in his face that wasn't there a moment before, visible even in the barn's dim light, even wet from the rain. He was turning something over, weighing it. Is that how you deal with things?" Caleb asked. "When something catches up to you, you just stand in it?" "I try to." Caleb looked up. "Has it worked?" Eli held his gaze. "The rain fell. Getting better at it," he said. Something happened in Caleb's expression then, a slow shift, like the first light of something, not dramatic, just a softening, a very small, very careful step toward something. And then Eli looked away because looking away was the sensible thing, because the storm was what it was and the barn was small and the rain was going to stop and the sun would come back and Caleb Merritt was going to leave and things would return to their proper shape, and he was fine with all of that. He was completely fine. The weekend became a week. It happened without anyone saying anything about it, without a formal renegotiation of the original terms. Caleb called a mechanic about his car. The mechanic found the car. The car, as it turned out, required a part that had to come from a dealer in San Antonio and would take 4 to 5 business days to arrive. This was simply the situation, and Caleb reported it to Eli and Dora with a practical evenness that didn't ask for anything. Dora waved her hand and said, "So you're here till the middle of next week. I'll need more help in the kitchen garden," and that was that. It was during this extended stay that things began to acquire edges. Not between Eli and Caleb. Between those two, things remained in the same quiet register they had established, easy, slightly careful, warm in the way that warmth is when you're not entirely sure what to do with it. No, the edges appeared elsewhere. The first was a man named Drew Calloway. Drew was a neighboring rancher, early 30s, broadly built, quick to laugh, generally regarded as a good person with good land and good horses. He stopped by on a Tuesday afternoon with a question about a shared water line at the property boundary, and he and Eli stood by the fence talking for 20 minutes with the easy efficiency of men who have dealt with land matters together before. This was entirely normal. This happened several times a year. What was different this time was that Caleb was working nearby. Eli became aware of this about halfway through the conversation, became aware that Caleb had stopped what he was doing, tightening a loose hinge on the pasture gate, and was standing with his back turned but clearly not working, in the way that a person stands when they are actually listening. Drew noticed Caleb. Drew, who was generally observant and socially easy, took the introduction when Eli offered it. He shook Caleb's hand, asked a few questions about where he was from, made a couple of easy jokes. Caleb responded with his usual natural warmth, and by the end of 5 minutes Drew was laughing at something Caleb had said with the comfortable openness of a man who has just unexpectedly met someone interesting. "Come by Saturday," Drew said to Caleb before he got back in his truck. "We do a get-together most summer Saturday nights, nothing fancy, fire, food, a few people." He glanced at Eli. "Eli never comes, but the invitation stands for him too." "I might," Caleb said. "Good," Drew pointed at him, "I'll hold you to that." He drove away. Eli went back to what he'd been doing. Caleb went back to the gate hinge. For about 3 minutes, everything was normal. Then Caleb said casually, without looking up from his work, "Why don't you go to those things, the Saturday gatherings?" "Not my scene," Eli said. "People, fire, food." "People," Eli repeated. "You like people." "I like some people." He was doing something with the fence wire that did not require much of his attention. And the thing about tasks that don't require much attention is that your mind goes where it wants, and his was going, without his full permission, to the image of Caleb shaking Drew Calloway's hand and smiling with that particular ease that Eli had been watching for a week and a half now. "Would you go," Caleb said even more casually, "if someone went with you?" Eli's hand stilled. He didn't turn around. He finished the section of fence wire he was on before he trusted himself to respond. "Maybe," he said. "Hypothetically," Caleb said. "Hypothetically." "Interesting." Caleb tightened the last bolt on the hinge and stood, brushing his hands on his jeans. "I'm just going to put that information somewhere." Eli looked at him over his shoulder. Caleb was looking at the gate with an entirely neutral expression, the kind of neutral that is in fact its own kind of expression. "Don't put it anywhere," Eli said. "Too late," Caleb said cheerfully and picked up his tool bag and went toward the barn. Eli turned back to his fence wire. His hands were not entirely steady. He didn't analyze this, he noted it, filed it, and went back to work. The second edge arrived 2 days later in the form of a woman named Lacey Brennan. Lacey was a friend of Dora's, a decade younger, who came by on Thursday afternoon to drop off a borrowed casserole dish and stayed for iced tea on the porch. She was warm and gregarious and took a very natural interest in Caleb, who was sitting on the porch when she arrived, and who she immediately latched onto as new and interesting, which he objectively was in this context. This was entirely fine. This was normal social interaction between adults, and Eli had no feeling about it whatsoever. He told himself this from the barn doorway where he was standing watching the porch. Lacey was asking Caleb something. Caleb was answering with that slight smile. Lacey laughed. Caleb looked pleased. Dora watched both of them with the expression of a woman who is seeing everything and saying nothing and will have opinions about all of it later. Eli turned and walked back into the barn. He spent a productive 45 minutes doing a very thorough cleaning of the tack room that he had been meaning to do for 2 weeks, and when he came out, Lacey was gone and Caleb was alone on the porch again, reading. Eli came up the steps and sat in the other rocking chair. "She's nice," Caleb offered without looking up from his book. "She is," Eli agreed. A pause. "She asked if I was staying in the area long term." Caleb turned a page. "I said I didn't know." "Is that true?" Caleb looked up from the book. He turned his head and met Eli's gaze, and the look on his face was one that Eli had been seeing more and more, that careful, open look, stripped of its armor, sitting close to something that had not yet been said. "Yeah," Caleb said quietly, "it's true." Eli looked at the yard, at the horses, at the horizon. "The car part gets in Friday." "I know. So you could be gone by Saturday." "I could. Will you bait?" The question came out before he decided to ask it. It landed in the air between them, and Eli would have taken it back except that it was already there, already said, and taking it back would make it worse. Caleb set his book down on his knee. He looked at Eli with those dark eyes in the late afternoon light, steady and serious and not looking away. "Do you want me to be?" he asked. The question was perfectly level. It wasn't pressure. It wasn't a trap. It was a genuine question, one that was trusting Eli with the honest answer, whatever that answer was. Eli looked at him. "The honest answer?" "No," Eli said quietly, plainly, the way he said most things, "I don't." Caleb looked at him for a long moment. Something crossed his face, something that was very close to relief and very close to something else, something warmer and more dangerous and considerably more complicated. "Okay," Caleb said. He picked his book back up. He didn't say anything more. Eli rocked slowly in the chair. The evening came on. Friday arrived with a clear sky and a stillness in the air that felt almost deliberate, like the land was holding its breath for something. The car part came in as expected. Marco drove Caleb into town in the afternoon to deal with it, the mechanic, the part, the car, the logistics of getting everything in order for a departure. Eli stayed at the ranch and worked, which was what he did and what made sense and what did not require him to think about whether he was glad to be staying or not. He was reshoeing Luna in the barn when he heard hooves and voices in the yard 2 hours later, and he came to the barn door and watched the truck come up the long drive, and Caleb got out, and Caleb was talking to Marco, and Marco was laughing at something, and Caleb had his hands in his pockets and his head tilted, and the late afternoon sun was doing something to his hair that Eli was not going to describe, even internally. "Car's fixed," Caleb said when he came into the barn. "Good," Eli said and went back to Luna. A pause. Caleb leaned against the stall door. "Mechanic says it'll hold, said I should have taken better care of the coolant system." "He's right." "I know." Another pause. "I don't know a lot about cars." "I know." He'd noticed this in the first 2 days when Caleb was talking about the breakdown. There was a gap in Caleb's practical knowledge that was specific and interesting. He knew a great deal about land and agriculture and living things, but almost nothing about machines, as if he'd been educated in 2 parallel tracks that never quite met. "I know about land," Caleb said, as if following the same thought, "just not the things between land and people." "Cars. Metaphorically." Eli set down his tools and looked at him over Luna's back. "What does that mean?" Caleb looked at his feet. He was doing the thing he sometimes did, assembling words in the right order before releasing them. "I know how I feel about things," he said. "About places, about work, about," he paused, "people when it matters. I just don't always know what to do about it." Eli held his gaze. "The distance between feeling something and doing something about it," Caleb said, "is where I get lost." Something in Eli's chest was doing something slow and complicated. He straightened and walked around Luna to the stall door to the same side as Caleb. He was not sure what he intended. He stopped about 2 feet away, close enough to be a different kind of proximity than they'd been in before, and looked at Caleb directly. "I know that distance," he said. Caleb's eyes were very still. "Yeah." "Yeah," he held the look. "I've been standing in it for about 10 days. The words were out, they were there, they could not be unheard. Caleb's breath changed, subtly, almost imperceptibly, just a slight catch and then an exhale that was slightly longer than it needed to be. His eyes did not look away. The space between them seemed, somehow, to have gotten smaller without either of them moving. Eli, he started. And then Ranger, from 3 stalls down, let out a tremendous snort and stamped his feet in the specific way that meant I have been ignored for an unreasonable amount of time, and someone should come deal with that right now. The moment broke. Caleb laughed, a real one, startled out of him, and the laugh was warm and helpless and completely involuntary, the best kind. Eli felt his own chest loosen, felt the corner of his mouth pull up against his better judgment. "Your horse," Caleb said, still half laughing. "Yeah," Eli was already moving toward Ranger's stall. "He has opinions about things. Including," Caleb said, following, apparently about this conversation. "He's protective?" Eli reached Ranger's stall and the big chestnut immediately pressed his nose against Eli's chest in the particular way that meant "This is fine now, I'm satisfied." Eli ran a hand along his neck. "He doesn't like uncertainty." "Smart horse?" Caleb stepped up beside Eli and looked at Ranger with a respectful caution. He'd had exactly this much distance from Ranger for the entire week and a half, and Ranger had not objected to this arrangement. Can I let him come to you?" Caleb extended one hand flat and waited. Ranger looked at the hand, looked at Eli, looked at the hand again. Then, with the considered deliberateness of a horse who does not make decisions lightly, he stretched his nose forward and touched it to Caleb's palm. Caleb went very still. Eli watched. Ranger huffed once against Caleb's hand. Caleb's fingers curved slowly around Ranger's nose, the lightest possible touch. Ranger did not move away. "He likes you," Eli said. He heard the faint quality in his own voice and didn't entirely know what to do with it. Caleb looked up at him. They were standing close together in the narrow stall doorway, both facing Ranger, close enough that their arms were almost touching. Caleb was looking at Eli with an expression that was full to the edges with something that had no safe container. "I like him too," Caleb said. He was not entirely talking about the horse. Eli met his eyes. The barn was very quiet. That evening Eli was late coming in. He'd stayed out past the end of the work, checking fences that didn't need checking, walking the south pasture in the last of the light for no reason he could have articulated precisely, just needing the open space and the darkening sky and the grass under his boots, and the time to think without anything requiring anything of him. He was, if he was being honest and with himself when no one was watching, he generally was afraid. Not of Caleb, not of the feeling. He'd been honest about what he told Caleb in the barn about standing in the distance between feeling and doing. He knew what the distance felt like from the inside. He'd lived in that distance for years, the way you live on a ranch, because it was yours, because it was familiar, because the work of it filled the days, because it was safer and more knowable than the unknown alternative. What he was afraid of specifically was what came after. What came after you stepped out of the distance. The thing you couldn't unsee, couldn't unknow, couldn't unfeel, because his life was here on this land in this particular shape. And Caleb Merritt's car was fixed, and Caleb Merritt had been going somewhere west, somewhere with fewer people who knew him, and that somewhere was not this ranch in central Texas. He came up from the south pasture as the last daylight left the sky, stars beginning to appear in the east, and he saw the light on in the kitchen and the shape of Caleb at the kitchen table, and he stood outside the fence gate for a moment looking at that lit window. Then he went in. Caleb was making coffee. He'd learned where everything was by the end of the first week, and he moved through Dora's kitchen with the ease of someone who has quietly decided that a place is temporarily his and is treating it accordingly. He glanced over when Eli came in. "Long night check," he said. "Yeah." "Coffee." "Yeah." They sat across from each other at the kitchen table, the way they had on that first morning before sunrise, and drank their coffee and didn't say anything for a while. Outside, an owl called once from the cottonwood trees. "My car is ready," Caleb said. "I know. I could leave tomorrow." "I know that too." Caleb turned his cup in his hands. Eli watched him do it. He had been watching Caleb turn things, cups, tools, thoughts in his hands for a week and a half, and it was a tell, he'd realized. Not of nervousness exactly, of processing, of Caleb working something through. "What would you do," Caleb said carefully, "if I did leave tomorrow?" "Work," Eli said, "same as I always do." And would that be? Caleb stopped, started again, would that be fine? Eli looked at him. No, he said. Caleb looked up. It wouldn't be fine, Eli said. It would be how things are, that's different. Caleb held his gaze. What's the difference? Fine means you've accepted something easily. This wouldn't be easy. He said it the way he said everything, plainly, without flourish, because that was how he knew how to say things. But I wouldn't ask you to stay. That's not something I do, ask for things. What if I wanted to be asked? The question was very quiet, very direct, the way Caleb's questions always were when they mattered. Eli looked at him for a long moment. Then I'd say, he said slowly, carefully, picking each word, that I would very much like you to stay longer. Caleb breathed. How much longer? He asked. I don't know, Eli said honestly. I don't know how that works. I'm not. He stopped, started over. I don't know the shape of this. I know the shape of land. I know the shape of seasons and work and what things require. I don't know the shape of this. But I know that every day for the past week and a half I've come in from the work and found you somewhere on this property, and that has been, he paused, different from every other day I can remember. Caleb was looking at him with that full, open expression, not moving, waiting. And I don't know what to do with that, Eli said, except to say it out loud, which I've now done. A silence. Then Caleb said very quietly, me either. But I don't think that means we shouldn't try to figure it out. Eli looked at him. And then, without either of them deciding to do it, or planning it, or making any kind of announcement, they were both standing. They were both standing and the table was between them, and then the table was not between them. And Caleb was there, right there, close enough that Eli could see the small scar at the corner of his eyebrow, could see the way his chest was rising and falling slightly too fast, could see in his dark eyes something that had been building and building for days, held carefully in check. Held back with the patience of someone who was very much afraid of getting it wrong. Eli raised one hand and pressed it against the side of Caleb's face. Caleb's breath stopped. His eyes closed for just a second, that single second where you receive something you have been waiting for without knowing how long you've been waiting, and when they opened again, they were full of everything. What happened next was slow and careful and certain and private. And the kitchen light stayed on. He woke with the pale early morning light coming through the east window, which was different from the usual. Usually he woke to darkness, 5:45, the sky not yet gray. He'd slept late. He hadn't slept past 6 in as long as he could remember. For exactly 2 seconds, lying in the familiar narrow dark of his room with the sound of the ranch beginning to stir outside, he was just a man waking up. And then the second ended and everything he was waking up into arrived all at once, and he lay there looking at the ceiling while his chest did something large and unmanageable. He heard the kitchen. Eli was a person who processed things slowly and thoroughly, which meant he lay there for another minute taking stock of himself in the careful way he might check a fence line methodically, section by section. What was different? What felt wrong? What felt right? Nothing felt wrong. This surprised him a little because things he had been waiting for often disappointed him, arrived smaller than anticipated, carrying more complicated edges than the anticipation had suggested. This did not feel smaller. This felt like standing outside in the early morning with the light just beginning and the whole day ahead, which was simply the way the world felt when everything in it was where it should be. He got up, he went to the kitchen. Caleb was there. He was at the stove this time, working with focused care through the process of making actual breakfast, real breakfast, eggs and toast, and something in a pan that smelled like the fresh herbs from Dora's kitchen garden. He was wearing one of Eli's shirts again, the old blue one, and his hair was doing what it did in the mornings. And when Eli came in from the hall, he looked up and the expression on his face was something. It was something Eli did not have a precise word for, warm and slightly terrified and deeply glad all in the same breath. I made breakfast, Caleb said. I can see that. I found the eggs, I hope that was fine. There are always eggs. Caleb nodded, looking back at the pan. He turned the heat down. He was holding himself slightly carefully, the way people do in the first morning of a new thing when the reality of it is still crystallizing and you're not sure yet how much room it takes up, how much space it needs, whether the world has changed the way it felt like it changed or whether daylight will revise that. Eli crossed the kitchen and poured 2 cups of coffee. He brought one to the stove and set it beside Caleb's hand. Caleb looked at it, then looked at Eli. And Eli met his eyes and held them steadily the way he held most things, without drama, without performance. Just, I am here and nothing has changed except that I am even more certainly here than I was yesterday. Caleb exhaled slowly, like he'd been holding that breath since dawn. "Good morning," he said. "Morning," Eli said. And they stood side by side at the stove and made breakfast together. And outside, the sky was going from pink to gold, and the horses were moving in the south pasture, and Dora's cottonwood trees were catching the first breeze of the day, and the Harrow Ranch was beginning another morning exactly as it had begun 10,000 mornings before it. Just with one more person in the kitchen. The weekend came. Drew Calloway's Saturday gathering was still an open invitation, and Caleb still intended to go, and on Saturday morning, Caleb looked at Eli over the breakfast table and said, hypothetically. Eli looked at him. "If you came with me," Caleb said, "to the gathering, hypothetically." Eli ate his eggs. "That's not a hypothetical anymore," Eli said. "I know," Caleb said. "I thought I'd try a different approach." "Different from what?" "From the one where I just ask you directly and you give me a look." "I don't give looks." "Eli," Caleb said it the way he always said it, like a decision, "you give looks." The corner of Eli's mouth moved. It did this without any instruction from him. It had been doing it more frequently in the past 2 days, this uninstructed movement. He was nodding it. He was, broadly, not minding it. "Fine," he said. Caleb went very still. "Fine as in you agree, or fine as in?" "Fine as in yes," Eli said. "I'll go." Caleb looked at him. The expression on his face was the one that Eli had stopped trying to look away from, the full, open, unarmored one. The one that was its own kind of answer to questions neither of them had formally asked yet. "Okay," Caleb said quietly. "Good." Drew Calloway's Saturday gathering turned out to be exactly what Drew had described, and nothing more: fire, food, a handful of people from the surrounding area, easy and unpretentious and genuinely welcoming in the way that communities built on proximity and mutual reliance often were. Eli knew several people there. Caleb knew no one and fit in within 20 minutes because that was what Caleb did. But here was the thing Eli noticed: Caleb stayed close. Not obviously, not in a way that anyone else would have clocked or commented on, but within the natural movement of the evening, the shifting of groups, the migration from fire to table to fire, Caleb kept a proximity to Eli that was slightly less than the neutral social distance of strangers. When Eli moved, Caleb's position adjusted, not following exactly but recalibrating, maintaining a thread. When someone said something that Caleb wanted Eli's reaction to, he'd glance sideways. When Eli said something dry and quiet that could have been missed, Caleb was the one who heard it and whose expression changed. Drew noticed. Eli saw the moment Drew noticed, saw it in the slight recalibration of Drew's own expression, the small click of understanding. Drew was a perceptive man and not an unkind one. He said nothing about it. He said a great deal else, kept the evening easy and generous and good, and when they left just after 9, he shook both their hands and said, "Come back anytime," and meant it for both. In the truck on the way back to the ranch, Caleb said, "Thank you for coming." "It was fine," Eli said. "More than fine." Eli looked at the road. "Yeah," he conceded, "more than fine." Caleb turned to look at him from the passenger seat. Eli kept his eyes on the road, but he felt the look the way you feel a hand on your shoulder. "I'm glad," Caleb said simply. Eli reached across the center console and found Caleb's hand and held it without looking away from the road. Caleb's fingers wound through his and held back. Neither of them said anything else until they got home. 3 days later, things broke open. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a fight. It was quieter than that and quietly awful, and happened over 20 minutes in the kitchen on a Tuesday evening in the way that the hardest things often happen, not in the middle of something important but at the end of a normal day, when the defenses are down and words are said without the full weight of their consequences. Caleb had been on his phone. He'd had it set to silent for most of his stay, calls going to voicemail, responses delayed. Eli had noticed but not asked. It wasn't his place. And then that evening at the kitchen table, while Eli was sitting across from him going through the ranch accounts, Caleb answered a call. Eli didn't mean to listen. He went back to his accounts. But the kitchen was small, and after the first 30 seconds it was impossible not to understand the shape of what was happening even without every word. The voice on the other end was older, male, tight with something that could have been worry and could have been the beginning of anger. Caleb's side of the conversation was careful, restrained, measured, the voice of someone managing something rather than talking freely. "I know, Dad, I know. No, I am fine, I'm fine. That's not no, I didn't mean it like that. I know what you think, you've made it clear." A pause, something longer on the other end. Because I needed to think, because I needed space too. Another pause, then quieter. That's not fair. And then Caleb's eyes came up from the table and found Eli looking at him across the kitchen, and the expression on Caleb's face in that moment was something that Eli had not seen before, something cracked open, something that was fighting to hold its shape. Caleb stood up and walked to the back door and finished the call on the porch, and when he came back in 10 minutes later, everything about him was different. The openness was gone. The careful warmth, the ease, all of it had gone somewhere, pulled back behind something that looked like composure but was too deliberate for that. He sat back down. "You okay?" Eli asked. "Fine," Caleb said, his voice was even. "Caleb." I said I'm fine, not cold, not unkind, just closed. Eli recognized the closed door. He'd lived behind one long enough to know what it looked like from the outside. He went back to his accounts. The kitchen was quiet. The owl outside called twice. After a while, Caleb said, "He wants me to come home." Eli set down his pen. "He's found a position for me through a friend." Caleb looked at the table. "Something I'm suited for, apparently, something good, stable, practical." He said the last word with a flatness that made Eli hear the conversation that had surrounded it. "Is it something you want?" "No." Immediately, then softer, "I don't think so. I don't know. When he talks about it, it sounds like it makes sense. It sounds like it should be what I want." He pressed his hands flat on the table. "That's the part that's hard. It all sounds so reasonable from the outside. What does it sound like from the inside?" Caleb was quiet for a long moment. "Like a room with no windows," he said at last. Eli looked at him. "He doesn't know," Caleb said, his voice was low. "About who I am, about what I need, about—" He stopped, his hands tightened briefly on the table. "He has an idea of me and I've let him keep it because it was easier. Because every time I've thought about changing it, I think about how it will land and I can't." He stopped again. "I'm tired of being afraid of that conversation." "Then don't be," Eli said. Caleb looked at him. "It's not that simple." "I know it's not," Eli said. "I'm not saying it is. I'm saying the thing you're afraid of is holding you still, and I know what that looks like because I did it too." "Did you tell your family?" "My family was Dora, so yes." He paused. "She told me she'd known since I was 16 and was waiting for me to figure out she didn't care." Something passed across Caleb's face, tender and grief-adjacent. "Mine won't say that." "Maybe not," Eli said, "or maybe differently, but the version where he never knows isn't better. It's just—" He thought of what he'd said on the fence rail in the dark about standing in what catches you. "It's just prolonged." Caleb looked at him for a long time. The expression on his face was working through something. Eli could see it, the slow processing, the way Caleb turned things in his mind, the way he turned cups in his hands. "I need to think," Caleb said. "Okay. He stopped. "I might need some time, some space too." "Okay," Eli said again. He stood and cleared his coffee cup to the sink and didn't make the moment bigger than it was. "I'll be outside if you need me." He went outside. He sat on the porch in the dark for a long time, and the owl called, and the horses breathed somewhere in the south pasture, and the stars were enormous. The next day Caleb was different. Not unkind, not distant in any pointed way. He was present, physically present at breakfast, at the day's work, at dinner, but the particular quality of his presence had changed. He'd gone back behind something. The full, unarmored openness of the past week had been carefully folded up and put somewhere out of reach, and what was out and visible was the other version of Caleb, the competent, warm, socially easy, wry and capable version that was also genuine but was also unmistakably the version that was managed. Eli noticed this and said nothing. He was not going to make it worse by being the kind of person who asked too much. He was not going to perform concern. He was simply going to be what he always was, present, available, consistent, and let Caleb process whatever he was processing in whatever way he needed to process it. This was the right approach. He knew it was the right approach. It was also, it turned out, quietly terrible. Because the thing about having the version you'd been given and then having it be withdrawn, even temporarily, even for reasons that were entirely legitimate, was that it made visible how much you had come to depend on it. How much you'd calibrated to it without knowing you were doing so. How much difference there was between the ranch before Caleb arrived and the ranch as it had been for the past 2 weeks, and now between the ranch as it had been in those 2 weeks, and the ranch as it was in these 2 days of the managed distance. He told himself he wasn't counting the days. He was absolutely counting the days. On the third day of this, Marco appeared at Eli's elbow while he was sharpening blades in the workshop and said, without preamble, "You know you're allowed to say something." Eli kept sharpening, nothing to say. Marco looked at him with the steady patience of a man who has known you for 5 years and is not taken in by anything. "Sure," he said. "Marco, I'm just saying he's waiting for something, and you're waiting for him to stop waiting, which means both of you are waiting, which means nothing happens, which is very classic of the two of you specifically." Eli set down the blade. "Classic of the two of us, we've known each other 2 weeks. "Some things are immediately classic," Marco said, with the dignity of a man who has made an excellent point and knows it, and went back outside. On the fourth day, Eli went looking. He didn't make a production of it. He finished the morning work, found that Caleb was not in the usual places, not the porch, not the barn, not the kitchen, and walked out to the East Ridge. Because the East Ridge was where you went on this property when you needed to think. It was where Eli had gone for years, through the things that had required working through the after of his parents leaving when he was 12 and his father's death when he was 17, and the long quiet reconstruction of himself as the sole working future of a ranch that might not make it, and the years of learning what he wanted, and the years of not knowing what to do with wanting it. The ridge was his and Dora's, shared for years, the place the ranch looked smallest from and the world looked biggest. Caleb was there. He was sitting on the same flat limestone outcropping where Eli usually sat, knees drawn up, looking east at the long view of the ranch below and the country beyond. He heard Eli's footsteps. You always heard footsteps on this ridge, but he didn't turn until Eli was right there. Then he turned. And his face was the honest one, not managed, not protected, just honest, tired a little and working through something, and open the way it was on those nights early in the stay when the defenses came down in the dark because there wasn't enough energy to hold them up anymore. Eli sat down beside him on the flat rock. "I called him," Caleb said. Eli waited. "Not about the position." He looked out over the valley. "About me, about who I am, about all of it." He paused. "I didn't plan to, I was just talking and then it was out and then," he let out a long breath. He was quiet for a very long time. And then he said he needed a few days. "Okay. That's it, that's all he said. I need a few days." Caleb's voice was steady but thin at the edges. "I don't know what that means. I don't know if that's the beginning of something or the end of something or just nothing, just pause, just a man who needs a few days to catch up to what he just heard." He pressed his hands flat on the rock. "I've been sitting with not knowing for 3 days and he stopped. "It's hard." "Yeah," Eli said. "I shut you out," Caleb said. He turned his head and looked at Eli directly. "When I was processing, I shut you out and I know that wasn't fair. I just didn't have anything to give while I was in it. I was," he searched for the word, "empty." "I know," Eli said. "You don't need to explain it." "I want to." Caleb's eyes were very clear and direct. "Because I want you to know it wasn't about you, it wasn't doubt about this." He gestured at the space between them, small and specific. "It was fear about something else, and fear made me go small, and going small meant going away from." He stopped, looked at the valley. "From the thing I actually want to go toward." Eli looked at him. He thought about the fence line and the early mornings and the kitchen in the dark and the look on Caleb's face when Ranger first touched his hand and the sound of his name said like a decision. He thought about what Marco had said, "Some things are immediately classic." "The day I found you," Eli said, "you asked me if I was real." Caleb looked at him. "You were half conscious, you had a concussion, you'd been in the sun for 3 days." He paused. "But you asked that first." "I know," Caleb said softly. "I've been thinking about why you asked that." Eli looked at the valley, the way the morning light lay flat and gold across the grass. "I think you'd been alone with yourself for long enough that you couldn't tell what was real anymore, what you were allowed to have, what was actually there versus what you were hoping was there." Caleb was very still. "I'm real," Eli said. He turned and met Caleb's eyes. "This is real, whatever this is, however it goes from here. It's not something you imagined. It happened, it's happening." He held the look. "I need you to know that because I think you're still not sure." Caleb's eyes were very bright. "I'm sure," he said. "Are you?" "Yes, quiet, certain. I'm sure about this. I'm terrified about everything else, and I don't know what my father is going to say when he calls back, and I don't know where I'm going from here, and I don't know. His voice broke very slightly and he caught it. I don't know a lot of things, but I know this. Eli looked at him for a long moment. Then he reached out and put his arm around Caleb's shoulders and pulled him close, and Caleb came, dropped his head against Eli's shoulder, and they sat on the flat limestone at the top of the ridge with the valley spread out below them and the sky enormous above, and nothing was simple and nothing was resolved and everything was still uncertain. But it was real. It was unmistakably, completely, beautifully real. The call from Caleb's father came on a Thursday morning. Eli was in the barn when he heard Caleb's voice from the porch. He wasn't listening, wasn't trying to listen, was simply near enough that he heard the timbre of it. He heard the way the conversation started carefully, the careful management, and then something shifted, something in Caleb's voice changed, became freer, less contained. He heard something that might have been a laugh, brief and slightly disbelieving, the laugh of someone who has received unexpected news. He waited. 20 minutes later, Caleb appeared at the barn door. He stopped there in the light, looking at Eli across the dim barn interior, and the expression on his face was the one Eli had learned to read as the truest one, the full, open, unguarded one. It was shot through with something complicated that was trying and mostly succeeding at becoming something simpler. He wants me to come see him, Caleb said. He stopped. He said he'd been thinking about who I was as a kid, about what made me who I am. He said another stop. His jaw worked briefly. He said he loved me and he said he was scared, but that he wanted to know. He pressed his hand briefly against his mouth, then lowered it. He wants to know. Eli stood very still. He searched for the word. I know, Caleb said, his voice was full. I know. Eli crossed the barn. Caleb was still standing in the doorway, half in the light and half in the shadow, and when Eli reached him he brought his hand up and pressed it against the side of Caleb's face the way he had in the kitchen, the first time, simple, certain, steady. Caleb closed his eyes for a second. So you're going, Eli said. I need to, he opened his eyes. I need to go be honest with him in person. I need to, he exhaled. I need to close the distance, like you said. I know. And then, Caleb lifted his hand and covered Eli's against his cheek. I don't know what then looks like, I don't know what a shape like this. He moved his thumb briefly across Eli's hand, looks like over distance. Over time, I don't know how any of that works. Neither do I, Eli said honestly, but I know how to work on things. Caleb looked at him, the ghost of a smile. Yeah. I've been running this ranch since I was 18, Eli said. I have not historically given up on things because they require sustained effort. The ghost of a smile became the real thing, full and warm and wrecking, the one Eli had been watching for 2.5 weeks, the one he was becoming increasingly aware he'd been watching for a great deal longer than 2.5 weeks in the larger sense. That is, Caleb said, possibly the most romantic thing you have ever said to me. There was nothing romantic about it. You called me a ranch. I definitely did not. You implied I was worth sustained effort. Eli stopped, his jaw was doing something, his face was doing several things. You're impossible, he said. I'm leaving tomorrow, Caleb said, and the smile dimmed slightly, to drive up to see my father. I know. And then we figure out what then looks like, Eli said, same as anything. Caleb looked at him for a long moment, with the full weight of whatever had been building in him across all of these days. The creek bed and the spare room and the fence rail in the dark and the barn in the storm and the kitchen at 5 in the morning and the ridge, all of it present in his expression, all of it real and certain and his. He leaned forward and pressed his forehead against Eli's, and they stood like that in the doorway of the barn, foreheads touching, Eli's hand against his face, Caleb's hand over Eli's, the morning light coming in around them from outside. Thank you, Caleb said quietly, for finding me. You were on Harrow land, Eli said. A pause. You said that to me, Caleb said, in the beginning. I remember. I didn't understand it then. Do you understand it now? Caleb pulled back just slightly and looked at him, dark eyes, everything in them. Yeah, he said, I think I do. He packed light. He had arrived with a backpack and a broken car and nothing much else, and he left much the same, the backpack, the borrowed flannel folded neatly on the spare room bed with the blue-checked curtains, the borrowed jeans pressed and stacked beside it. Dora made breakfast, a real one, large and warm, the kind she made on mornings that mattered. Marco ate 3 helpings and didn't say much, but when Caleb thanked him for teaching him how to read the cattle's movement in the afternoon to forecast weather, Marco clapped him on the shoulder with the firmness of a man giving real approval. Ranger accepted a last brief hand on his nose, considered it, and tossed his head in a way that could have been any number of things. "He likes you," Eli said for the second time. "I like him," Caleb said for the second time. They looked at each other. They walked together out to the truck, Caleb's car, retrieved from the mechanic, sitting in the drive. Everything that needed to be said had largely been said. There was a phone number, there were intentions. There was the shape of something that was not a beginning and not an end but a middle, the particular middle of 2 people who have found each other in an unexpected place and are choosing to remain found regardless of geography. Caleb put the backpack in the passenger seat. He came back around to where Eli was standing. "I'll call," Caleb said. "I know you will." "And he stopped. "I don't know when I'll be here," Eli said. Caleb looked at him. "You'll always just be here." "This is where I am," Eli said. "Come find me." Something moved across Caleb's face, something large and quiet and complete. He stepped forward and hugged him, arms coming around Eli's shoulders, and Eli brought his arms around Caleb and held on, and they stood in the early morning dust of the Harrow Ranch Drive with the cottonwood trees catching the first breeze of the day and the horses moving somewhere in the south pasture, and everything exactly as it was and completely changed. Caleb pulled back. He looked at Eli for one long, clear, final moment. "I'll come find you," he said. Then he got in the car and the engine turned over and the dust rose slowly in the morning air, and the blue flannel shirt waved once from the window as the car turned at the gate and headed west down the county road. Eli stood in the drive. Ranger was at the fence. Eli walked to him and stood with one hand on the big chestnut's neck, watching the dust settle back to earth where Caleb's car had been. The morning was already warm, the work waited. The ranch stretched out in every direction unchanged. Except, everything was changed. Not in the large way of things that demand acknowledgement and ceremony. In the small, thorough way of things that have grown into the structure, worked their way into the grain of it, become part of how it holds together. In the way that matters most and lasts longest. He turned back toward the barn. "Come on," he said to Ranger. The horse fell into step beside him. Epilogue 6 weeks later. The morning he came back, Eli was on the East Ridge. He went there most mornings now. He wasn't sure when that had happened, when the ridge had become a morning ritual rather than a thinking through something destination. He thought he might know when, but he didn't examine it too closely. Some things were better understood than analyzed. He heard the truck on the county road before he saw it, the sound carried up from the valley with the particular quality of sound in the early morning, clear and sharp before the day's heat bent it. He watched it come along the road, watched it slow at the gate, watched the gate open. He stayed on the ridge. The truck came up the long drive. He watched the figure that got out and stood looking at the house and then at the barn and then slowly at the ridge. Even at distance, he knew when Caleb found him. He watched him cross the yard and start up the ridge path, and he waited with the patience he'd been working on his whole life and had gotten considerably better at in the past 6 weeks of phone calls and long evenings and letters, actual letters, Caleb's handwriting small and neat in the margins of the pages. That had been both easier and harder than he'd expected, the way honest things always were. Caleb was breathing hard when he crested the ridge. He stopped a few feet away, looking at Eli with that expression, the open one, the honest one, the one that had been Eli's since the kitchen in the early morning and the fence rail in the dark. "Hi," Caleb said. "Hi," Eli said. A pause. The valley was beautiful below, the horses were moving in the south pasture, the sky was enormous. "He came to see the ranch," Caleb said. Eli looked at him. "Your father." "Last week I brought him to see it." He looked at the valley. "I showed him the pastures and the creek and the ridge." A small pause. "I showed him where you found me." "What did he say?" Caleb turned his head and met Eli's eyes, the corner of his mouth lifted. "He said it was a good place to end up." Eli looked at him for a long time. "He's not," Caleb paused, "he's not there yet fully, there are still things we're working through, but he showed up." Something in his voice was careful and very full. He said he wanted to understand. "That's everything," Eli said. "Yeah," Caleb's voice was quiet, "it is." They looked at each other in the early morning light on the ridge with the whole of the Harrow Ranch spread out below them. Everything that had been said and everything that remained to be said, and the long distance between those two things and the choice, made and continuing to be made, to close it. Caleb stepped forward. Eli reached out and took his hand. "You came back," Eli said. "I said I would." "I know." Caleb turned his hand palm up and laced his fingers through Eli's, standing beside him at the edge of the ridge, both of them looking out over the valley, the land golden in the first light, everything still and wide and possible. "I was thinking," Caleb said after a while, "about the south pasture rotation." "Were you?" "I've got some ideas. I sketched some things out." Eli looked at him sideways. "What?" Caleb said with absolute innocence. "You came back with pasture rotation sketches." "I also came back for other reasons." "Good to know." The pasture made the list. Caleb laughed, the startled, helpless, warm laugh that Eli had loved since a barn in a summer storm and still loved, and would love, he was beginning to understand, for a very long time. "I missed you," Caleb said when the laugh had settled. Eli squeezed his hand. "I know," he said, "I missed you too." The sun came up. The land came into its full morning gold. And two men stood on a ridge in Texas with their hands together and the whole day ahead of them, and it was not the beginning and it was not the end, but it was as real as the ground beneath their boots and the sky above their heads and everything in between. It was real.
The end. And that is enough. Because here is the thing about a cowboy who never asks for anything. When he finally reaches out his hand, he means it. And the man who walked into the dust, lost and afraid, left with something neither of them could have named on that first morning when one of them lay face down in the red clay and asked a stranger, "Are you real?" And the stranger said yes, and mean it, and kept meaning it. If this story found something in you that you didn't now needing finding, give it a like so more people can find it too. Subscribe so you never miss what comes next. Comment below what moment hit you the hardest. Was it the barn in the storm, the ridge at sunrise, the morning he came back? Tell me. I want to know. And I hear and I listening and I look every comment of you. And one last thing, Caleb come back with pasture rotation sketches. He also come back with a folder, and that folder was something Eli was not expecting. Thanks for watching and keep watching.